Okay, paper number 3 here in our series on running biomechanics is titled, "Is There an Economical Running Technique? A Review of Modifiable Biomechanical Factors Affecting Running Economy." This is by Dr. Izzy Moore, an excellent running biomechanics researcher. And this particular paper has been a really influential, impactful paper in the running biomechanics community. That last term I said there, impact, quote unquote impact, in biomechanics and in science is typically gauged by citation counts, which is the number of times a paper after it's published has been cited by other papers. I just checked on Google Scholar this morning, and this paper has been cited to date 159 times, and it's 3 years and change old here, published in 2016. That's a pretty large number of citations for a paper that's only a few years old. By comparison, my most heavily cited paper to date has 138 citations, so a little bit more than 20 fewer citations than this one, and it was published in 2007, so coming up on 13 years old here, where this paper is not quite 4 years old yet. So this has been a pretty impactful paper in the running biomechanics community, and it's just a great example of a really nice review article, very comprehensive, dense without being boring and too long, and just covers a lot of topics in a way that's really accessible to a wide range of expertise levels. Before we get into the guts of the paper here, I want to highlight a few things in terms of terms in the paper. In the paper, you will see it referring to different types of comparisons or different types of study designs. I think the term that the paper uses more frequently is inter-subject comparisons versus intra-subject comparisons. The terms that you'll see me using in class more frequently than those are between subjects versus within subjects. But these, if you're looking at top to bottom here, these are the same things. A between subjects study is the same thing as an inter-subject study, and a within subject study is the same as an intra-subject study. Between subjects here is like the example I gave in the previous lecture on testing running economy in the class. If we took everyone in the class and wanted to know who's the most economical runner, we'd put us all on a treadmill at some speed and measure our running economy, and then we could rank order who's most economical, who's second best, third, etc. If we measured everyone's running biomechanics when we were also testing their economy there, then we might find some biomechanical variable that correlated with running economy, that had a greater value, for example, in the more economical runners. And so if I'm not an economical runner, then you could look at me and say, well, maybe your value of this particular variable that we found a relationship with, maybe that's too low. Maybe you should run in a way that increases that value and you'll be more economical. That's risky and presumptuous from between subjects data. If you see somebody else running in a certain way who has a good economy and you have a bad economy, training yourself and changing your mechanics to run like that other person won't necessarily improve your running economy. It might or it might not. You don't really know from between subjects data. We can't infer what would happen if we changed an individual's biomechanics from differences in biomechanics between different people. There's too many confounders there. You know, people have different fitness levels, different body shapes and sizes, differences due to sex, differences due to footwear and nutrition, and all sorts of different confounding factors that could affect those between, inferring changes within a particular person from between subject differences. You can get a little more confidence, of course, from inferring how somebody could change their mechanics to have better economy from within subject comparisons. Like if you had me run with 5 different stride lengths, all at a certain speed, and tested my running economy at all those stride lengths. From that, you could, with greater confidence, reason out a causal relationship between my stride length and my running economy, and could find a stride length that's most economical for me specifically to run at. So just a caution there to be careful with results that are between subject results or between subject correlations, and inferring from that within a person how any specific individual should change their mechanics to necessarily improve their economy. That won't necessarily be something you can infer with confidence from between subject results. Okay, another kind of preliminary point I wanted to touch on before diving into the paper here relates to kind of the preliminary material here, where she is talking about competitive runners and about completing the race distance in a certain time, and the lowest time possible being kind of the goal of competition, and determinants of that performance level, and physiological determinants of that performance level. And you'll see these terms here from the Joyner paper that we read last time and already went over last time, the VO2 max and the lactate threshold and the running economy. One thing to keep in mind here is that if I improve my running economy, if I become a more economical runner, does this necessarily improve my performance? For example, does this necessarily increase my marathon speed or reduce the time it would take me to run a marathon? To my knowledge, the vast majority of data on that topic, on differences between running economy and running race performance, is between subject data, where people who are more economical runners tend to be faster marathon runners, faster 10K runners, whatever, faster runners in general. Again, then, it's risky to infer that, well, if somebody was to improve their running economy through whatever means, would they necessarily become a faster runner? The Joyner paper here, the Joyner equation from the paper last time says yes, right? If I increase running economy by 5%, everything else being equal, then my marathon running speed should increase by 5%. Something to keep in mind there is, remember, this Joyner equation is not your actual marathon running speed, it's your predicted marathon running speed. Okay? If you know your VO2 and your lactate threshold and your running economy, you can multiply those together and you can say this is your predicted marathon running speed. This is how fast we're estimating you could run a marathon. You still have to go out and do it, right? Or if you improve your running economy by 10%, you can say, oh, now I can race a marathon 10% faster. Well, yeah, maybe, but you still have to actually go out and run it at that speed and run it 10% faster. Okay? So be careful here with inferring improvements in performance from improvements in running economy. Most of that evidence is between subjects. There's a little bit of within subjects evidence on it. Not to say that running economy won't or shouldn't improve performance. In theory, it should, but there's not a great deal of evidence of it actually happening in practice, to my knowledge. Okay, we'll touch on this last one a little bit later on when I get to some of the other descriptors, some of the other results here in the paper. She does a great job here in this paper of breaking it down categorically into the different main categories of biomechanics variables that we tend to study in this field. There's spatiotemporal factors. A little bit later on, there's kinematic factors, kinetic factors, ground reaction forces, and joint moments and things like that. Neuromuscular factors, activation levels of the muscles from EMG, shoe and equipment, footwear, trunk and upper limb biomechanics. So a lot of depth to this paper and broken down in a very logical, very accessible way. I think is one of the reasons this has been such a popular and impactful paper. The spatiotemporal factors are first here, generally because they're the simplest of the running biomechanics variables that are included here, and they're also the ones that are most accessible to changing within an individual to examine their running economy. Now, that's where I wanted to get into this latter point here on my list of topics here, isolating changes in biomechanical variables, which the author also notes here in the abstract on assessing variables in isolation. In biomechanics, it's really difficult to assess an isolated change of a variable. And I'll give you an example of what I'm getting at there. Let me pull up my video here again and go to my budget gate lab here, the kitchen floor. Okay. Let's suppose that I am in the middle of my stance phase here with my right leg, and I find a result that says, well, having greater knee flexion in the stance phase is associated with better running economy. And so I want to have a more flexed knee in my stance phase of running. And you can see right there from that example that when I flex my knee more, I'm not just changing knee flexion, right? I'm not just changing the angle of this joint. I also changed the angle of my hip and the angle of my ankle down there, right? So I go from here to here and back again, and I can't just do that for my knee angle in isolation. I have to change lots of biomechanical variables about lots of other parts of the body to get that to happen. So can I really say with confidence that it's the knee angle that was doing that? Well, that's not quite so simple because I wasn't changing, or I'm not able to change the knee angle there in isolation. So it can often be really difficult in these sorts of studies where it's by definition like a whole body motion that involves movement of every part, literally every part of the body, to ascribe any sort of change in running economy to any particular single variable. Okay, for these spatiotemporal factors, anytime you see this term, spatiotemporal factors, in reference to any form of locomotion, not just running, but walking, running, sprinting, cycling, swimming, rowing, any sort of movement where you're doing this cyclical, repeated motion over and over again to translate the body over a certain distance. The speed at which you translate the body at is going to be the product of two biomechanical variables. It's going to be your stride length times your stride frequency. Okay? Stride length is how far my center of mass travels with each stride. That'll have units of meters. Stride frequency is how frequent I'm completing strides. That has units of 1/seconds. Your stride frequency, if that 1/seconds business is confusing, is also equal to the inverse of your stride duration, which has units of seconds. So if you take these two things and multiply them together, the stride length in meters times the stride frequency in inverse seconds there, you get speed, which has units of meters per second. Okay. So these spatiotemporal factors are primarily these two factors here, stride length and stride frequency. And if I want to run at a certain speed, say 4 meters per second, I could do that with, in theory, infinitely many combinations of stride length and stride frequency, right? I could do it with a stride length of 2 meters and a stride frequency of 2 hertz, or I could do it with a stride length of 4 meters and a stride frequency of 1 hertz, right? Or any other infinitely many different, subtly different, or drastically different combinations of these two values here, the stride length and the stride frequency, could all multiply together here to give me this 4 meters per second running speed. Now, if you go out and run at 4 meters per second, you'll notice that from stride to stride, you aren't just randomly, arbitrarily changing your stride length and your stride frequency. Every stride, you're keeping more or less the same stride length and more or less the same stride frequency to run at that speed. Okay? And that's what she's getting at here when she talks about the runner's preferred frequency or preferred length. It's that combination of stride length and stride frequency that you naturally use to run at a certain speed. Okay? She then goes on to define the mathematically optimal stride length or stride frequency. And that would be the combination of stride length and stride frequency to run at a certain speed that's most economical. So the combination of stride length and stride frequency that minimizes your metabolic cost of running at that speed, or that makes you the most economical at that speed. So preferred stride length and optimal stride length. Okay. Preferred here is the combination of stride length and stride frequency that you just naturally use to run at some speed. And optimal is the combination at that speed, that same speed, that would give you the most economical gait, the lowest metabolic cost of running. Okay? For well-trained runners, on average, their preferred stride length is really close to their optimal stride length. It may differ by like 3%. If you graph it and measure it and plot it out. But if they then change it if they change their preferred stride length to that optimal stride length by changing it by 1, 2, 3%, it really doesn't affect their running economy in any measurable way. And that's for well-trained, experienced runners. For less experienced runners, for novice runners or runners who haven't been at it very long, they sometimes tend to be overstriders, meaning their stride length is considerably long, their preferred stride length is considerably longer than their optimal stride length. And they might benefit from reducing their stride length a little bit to improve their running economy, if that's a goal of theirs. So if you have especially a novice runner, somebody who's an inexperienced runner, they might benefit from reducing their stride length and correspondingly increasing their stride frequency a little bit to run it at a certain speed. That may give them a more economical running gait and could hypothetically improve their performance up here. If it's an experienced runner, a serious runner, a competitive runner, chances are they've kind of already self-optimized their preferred stride parameters here and are probably pretty close to their optimal stride length. Even if they're a little bit off, changing it by just a percentage or two is probably not going to make any appreciable difference in the running economy. Okay, for kinematic variables here, and kind of throughout the rest of the paper, not just in this kinematics section, but in the rest of the text that follows here, you'll see she highlights a lot of conflicting results in the literature, where there's lots of studies you can find that report a finding between a certain biomechanical variable and a change or an association with running economy, but those results often aren't consistent from study to study. Meaning sometimes you'll find a study that reports a relationship between running economy and some variable, and then you'll find another study that measured that same variable and found no relationship with running economy. Or maybe found the opposite relationship, where study 1 said increasing variable X is better for economy, and study 2 said decreasing variable X is better for running economy. Not necessarily meaning that one is right and one is wrong. It could be different populations of runners, different circumstances and things like that. But some inconsistency there in general in terms of forming generalizable relationships between running biomechanics and running economy. And this is a good thing to keep in mind when you're doing your projects. If you find a particular study that has a compelling relationship for your research question in your project, even if it's a really cool finding and is really important and meaningful for your project, don't be satisfied with just that one study. Go to PubMed or go to Google Scholar and see if you can find other conceptually similar studies, similar designs and similar subjects and similar outcome variables, and see if they also found that same result as the other study. Or is this the only study that has ever found this, and several other studies have said, well, no, it might be a different result. If you can find multiple studies that all have a similar result, you're starting at least to become a strong base of knowledge and confirmation of that relationship. If you can only find one study, and especially if it's different from the results of many other studies that have examined that same thing, then you might dig into that study a little bit closer and see, okay, why do you have a different result from everyone else here? So just something to keep in mind when you're doing your projects. Look for multiple studies that may or may not have the same result. One cool finding that she highlights here in the lower limb kinematic factors that I wanted to cover in some detail is figure 2 here, where this is looking at the extension of the leg at toe off. And this is a neat result here. I think this was actually one of Izzy's dissertation studies that she published or that she finished shortly before writing this review article, where this was not a cross-sectional comparison. This was a neat study because it was a within subjects comparison. They had a group of runners who were novice runners. They did a 10-week running program, and then, of course, became more experienced runners through running over those 10 weeks. Over the 10 weeks, the runners improved their running economy, and also over the 10 weeks altered their running technique, their running biomechanics. And they then examined the changes in running biomechanics that were associated with the improvement in running economy within subjects. You won't find too many studies with that design, so this is a really interesting study and some really compelling results here. So one result that they did find is that in the pre-condition here, so in the novice runners while they were novices, prior to these 10 weeks of training here, when they were toeing off from the ground, when they were at the end of the stance phase and just about to pick their foot up off the ground and begin the swing phase, they had a relatively extended leg here at toe off, meaning their knee was extended here to almost full extension, to about 165 degrees between the thigh and the shank there. And their ankle was also pretty extended, plantar flexed by about 25 degrees there. After the 10 weeks of training, when their running economy improved, they then came back and measured the biomechanics again, and their knee was a little bit more flexed at toe off, and their ankle was a little bit less plantar flexed at toe off. So an overall more flexed posture of the leg here, kind of a more hunched up posture of the leg here at toe off when the runners became more economical. Now, why is that something that might be associated with running economy? The idea that she proposes here is that it might have reduced the leg's moment of inertia, which I think is a really compelling argument for why this might improve running economy. And I will try to demonstrate it again here in my very amateur gait lab. Okay, hopefully you guys can see my full leg here. Okay, so just pay attention to my right leg here. And let's pretend I'm at the end of my stance phase of running there. And if my leg is really extended, it's going to look like that. Okay? Versus if it's more flexed, it's going to look like that. And don't focus on my left leg here. I'm just using that to move my right leg up and down to have it be really extended here, or less extended, more flexed there. Okay? Now, why might it be a good thing to have a toe-off posture that looks like this at the end of the stance phase versus looking like this at the end of the stance phase? Well, to reason that out, let's think about what's the goal of the swing phase. Once my foot comes off the ground here, what am I trying to do? Well, I'm trying to swing the whole leg forward so that I can get ready for the next stance phase. Okay? Now, that process, or that task of swinging the whole leg forward, is going to be easier if I can reduce the moment of inertia of the leg in the swing phase. Now, what do I mean there by moment of inertia? Moment of inertia is like angular mass, okay? The more massive something is, the harder it is for me to translate. Like, here's my water bottle bowl for my little dog. It's little, and it's easy for me to translate it. Here is my water bottle bowl for my big dog. It's more massive, and it's harder for me to translate. I'm more forced to translate it. Moment of inertia is like the angular analog for mass. The more massive something is, the harder it is for me to translate it. The more moment of inertia something has, the harder it is for me to spin it or to rotate it. Okay? Now, in the swing phase of running, my goal is to rotate my whole leg about my hip here to bring it forward and get ready for the next stance phase. Okay? So to make that task as easy as possible on my hip flexors that swing the leg forward there, I'm going to want to take my mass of my leg and concentrate it as close as I can towards the axis of my hip joint here. Okay? That brings that mass as close as possible to this axis of rotation, minimizes the moment of inertia of all that mass, and makes it as easy as possible for the hip flexors to swing that leg forward. You can test this yourself if you just stand up on a counter like this. Stick your leg out fully extended like this and swing it back and forth. And that feels a lot more effortful, especially with your hip flexors, which aren't very big muscles, than packing that mass as close as you can to the hip and swinging it like that. It's a lot easier, especially to swing the leg forward in the low moment of inertia condition here when the mass is concentrated closer to the hip. So why might a more flexed posture rather than a more extended posture at toe off be better? Well, here I've already flexed a little bit and I'm already on my way to getting a low moment of inertia. So maybe by having a more flexed leg at toe off there, I can get into that posture quicker and spend more time in the swing phase with a low moment of inertia, and on average have a lower moment of inertia of my leg in the swing phase. So that's the argument that the paper puts forward for that more flexed posture at toe off being associated with improved running economy, and I think it's biomechanically a pretty compelling argument. Okay, that was the last main result that I was going to cover in the paper here. In the kinetic factors, there's a variety of variables that they go over. This is one of the areas where there's not a great deal of consistency in terms of what's been found for relationships between kinetic factors or force-related factors and changes in running economy. There have been some fairly consistent findings concerning things like leg stiffness and some parameters of ground reaction forces and things like that. But the difficult part there with kinetic factors is how you might actually train somebody to run with those different isolated changes in kinetic factors. That can be a challenging thing to do, to change a particular kinetic factor in isolation. Kind of like with the example I was giving early on in this lecture about how it can be difficult to change a single variable like that in isolation. One thing to keep in mind here, if you're not familiar with some of these terms, is you'll see the author refer to this term leg stiffness here. That's a dynamic biomechanical variable. That's not referring to like flexibility or like the stiffness of your muscles or like stretching or anything like that. This is a variable that you calculate from somebody's running biomechanics. It's the relationship between the ground reaction force under the feet and the vertical oscillations of the center of mass. The relationship or the ratio between those two things gives you the leg stiffness. And I believe the result here is that runners that have greater leg stiffness tend to have better running economy. But again, it can be difficult to isolate that to say, is it due to the differences in forces or due to differences in oscillations of the center of mass, and are these things that I should change and this will improve my running economy? It can be difficult to make those inferences and to actually implement those changes in actual runners. And same thing here for the neuromuscular factors. It highlights some studies that have found differences in activation levels of certain muscles and co-contraction indices, activation levels of muscles on opposite sides of the joint, and sometimes these are associated with better economy, sometimes worse economy, so it's quite a bit of inconsistency in the literature on that topic in particular. Last topic that she covers here is the equipment, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So this will be kind of our first intro here into effects of shoe parameters. The big one that she talks about is shoe mass. In general, a heavier shoe is detrimental for running economy. And this is because of the demonstration that I just gave on the swing phase. The heavier your foot is, or the heavier the mass of the shoe you have tied to the foot, the more effortful the swing phase is generally going to be. So generally having a lighter shoe is beneficial for running economy. Interestingly, and we'll talk about this quite a bit, we'll have two full papers on this, is this notion of the cost of cushioning hypothesis from Frederick. Ned Frederick was a very prominent biomechanics researcher on footwear in the 1980s. He's still active today and is still doing great research on footwear, but got his start in the 1980s doing some research on effects of shoe properties, including mass and cushioning, on the performance and economy of running. He came up here with the cost of cushioning hypothesis, which was the finding that if you control for shoe mass, like if you compare shoes that have the same mass, on top of that, then more cushioning isn't necessarily better, but some amount of cushioning in the shoes appears to be associated with improvements in running economy. So that having a cushioned shoe, as long as it's not too heavy or not too massive compared to some other shoe, can be beneficial for running economy. This was a hypothesis that Frederick came up with based on some data that he had that he then tested, and that some other researchers later on also tested and found some interesting results that we'll go over. Second to last topic, sorry. Very last topic that she goes over here is trunk and upper limb biomechanics. Suppressing arm swing, so running without arm swing, invariably increases the metabolic cost of running, or makes running more energetically effortful. And you can test this on a treadmill. Again, be careful here when you're trying these things due to the slow speed. But suppress your arm swings, like hold your arms across your chest and run. And you should pretty quickly feel that running becomes more difficult if you try to maintain the same speed with suppressed arm swing. When you're running with your arms, you'll notice that every time your left leg goes forward, your right arm also goes forward. This is because swinging your left leg forward will tend to want to rotate your whole body about your other leg, and will get you off axis and get you pointed in the direction other than the direction of progression where you want to go. So you normally swing your right arm forward at the same time as your left leg goes forward to counteract that angular momentum and get the whole body going forward in the direction of progression. When you don't swing your arms, you still need to swing your legs forward, and to maintain your speed, you got to take up that kind of balancing action with some other muscles, or change the way that the leg is using those muscles, and it can be uneconomical. So swinging without your arms is bad, so definitely swing your arms when you run if you want to be economical. But there's been no suggestions or no evidence, to my knowledge, that there's a particular economical arm swing biomechanics, that there's a certain way you should swing your arms beyond just swinging them in general. that's optimal for running economy. No evidence on that I know of. So don't worry too much about your arm swing. That's unlikely to be a major source of running economy. And same results here on like the posture and the lean of the trunk. Some studies find relationships there, some don't. Some find more trunk lean is better, some find less trunk lean is better. So no consistent findings there to make any recommendations. And that's kind of the recommendation that she ends up making here at the end concerning, is there an economical running technique? There's certainly a relationship between running biomechanics and running economy. In particular, it's very easy to change somebody's running biomechanics to make their running economy worse. It's relatively difficult, at least in my observations and experiences, to change somebody's running biomechanics to make their running economy better. In particular, there's not to date anything that we can consistently identify as like a biomechanical signature of good running form. So it's certainly possible to change running biomechanics in a way that improves running economy, but how you do that exactly in practice, like if you're a coach or if you're an athlete and want to change your own running biomechanics, is going to be very much a case-by-case and kind of trial and error process. It's very difficult to just look at somebody's body or to look at somebody run and say, oh, you need to do this or that, and this will improve your running biomechanics. It's going to be considerably more involved and effortful process than that. Okay, I can give you a couple examples here of good running biomechanics form, or quote-unquote good running biomechanics form, and one particular factor that you should keep in mind when you're watching individuals with good biomechanics and good running economy, and if you should try and run like these folks. This first video here is the guy we talked about last time, Eliud Kipchoge. He's shown here in the white, and this video is during the final kilometer of his run here, where he ran the marathon in less than 2 hours. He ran it in 1 hour, 59 minutes and 40 seconds, I believe. So he inched under the 2-hour barrier by about 20 seconds, and he's to date the only person to ever run a marathon in under 2 hours. He's currently the world record holder in the marathon, but his world record is not the time in this race. He was the only person running in this race, and there were some circumstances in terms of how the race was won that made it not within the rules of how formal world records are approved and ratified for road racing. In particular, you can see here he has some runners in the black shirts here who were his pace setters. Pace setters are a very normal, very legal thing in normal marathon road races. They're used all the time when somebody's going for a world record or a particular time. But what these pace setters did that was different from a normal race is he had different groups of pace setters who were cycling in and out of the race for the full 2 hours here, so that he always had a fresh set of pace setters here with him. That sort of thing is not allowed in normal marathon road racing. You can have pace setters, but they have to start the race at the same time as everyone else. And once they stop and once they leave the race, they can't come back in. So that was the main reason why this run, despite being as impressive as it was, wasn't a world record eligible run. If I remember right, there was also something about the fluids and nutrition that he was taking during the race. He wasn't like taking anything illegal, like what he was eating and drinking wasn't against the rules, but something about like the timing of when he got it or the means by which it was delivered to him or something like that was also outside the normal rules. So that's why this didn't count as a formal world record, yet it's still an incredibly impressive performance. If you go to the 2-minute mark here, you can see a shot of Kipchoge running by himself for a little while from the side. And he's somebody who's known as just having really excellent running biomechanics. You can see it on display here. Just a very smooth, kind of effortless looking gait, even though he's been running here for almost 2 hours and is probably pretty tired. High leg kick, look how high his heels get there. Nice high arm carriage. Just a beautiful running gait that this guy has. And he's probably the best marathon runner in the world for certainly the last 5 years, maybe the last decade or so. He's just an incredible talent at this distance and is known to have very excellent running biomechanics. So should you compare yourself to him? Should you try and run like he does and change your running biomechanics to have that arm carriage and that high leg kick and just that general form? One thing to keep in mind is that he's running really fast here. He's averaging, I think, about 4 minutes and 35 seconds per mile here. If you break that down to what does he average over 100 meters, it's about 17 seconds per 100 meters, which wouldn't be a dead sprint for like a healthy, fit young adult athlete, but it's a pretty darn fast speed to cover 100 meters in even once or twice, let alone doing 26 miles at that speed. So he's moving pretty fast here. So one thing to keep in mind when you're watching like elite marathon runners run with their excellent marathon form is that they're running really, really fast. And it's worth thinking about, is their speed from their form or is their form from their speed? Are they running that fast because of their good form, or are they running with that form because that's how you run when you're running that fast? I generally think it's more of the latter than the former. The form is caused by the speed. It's not it's not the other way around. It's not the form that they're using that's allowing them to run that fast. They're using that form because that's just what you do to run at that kind of speed. Most people, even if they're very, very fit, very healthy, very successful runners, won't ever run anywhere near this fast. To give you another example there, here's a video I found of two other elite marathon runners. It's really hard actually to find videos of elite runners running slowly, but this was a video of two other elite male runners who are very, very good, international world-class runners who are known to have really good running or really just classical running biomechanics. This is Mo Farah on the left, who's a British runner, and Galen Rupp on the right, who's an American runner, both known to have really good running biomechanics. And you can see here they're running on a treadmill. They're going to be running on treadmills as soon as I start it. And you can't really get a good shot of the speed on the treadmill, but just based on the speed of the belt, it doesn't look like they're going super fast here. So they're probably going at speeds that most of us could run at reasonably comfortably, unlike Kipchoge in the other video, who's going at an incredible speed that no one else has ever covered that distance in. And so here they are running on the treadmill at kind of pedestrian speeds. And especially for Mo Farah here on the left, like I would watch that, and I'm like, I wouldn't normally look at that person's legs moving like that and think, oh, that's an elite marathon runner. That guy must be world class there. He kind of just looks like the rest of us when he's running along there on the treadmill. So generally, I think that it's risky to look at the form that elites are using in races and use that to kind of guide how somebody should run when they're training at like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 minutes per mile rather than 4 minutes and 30 seconds per mile. So be careful there in observing what form elites were doing and inferring that that's necessarily how normal people should run most of the time. Okay, that is it for today.